Well, we finally planted blueberries in our yard. I have been looking forward to this for such a long time. They look happy so far. They turn nice and green after planting, and now that it's getting colder, their leaves are starting to turn a nice deep crimson. But they look good now. It was a little bit of a bumpy road to get these planted, not because they're physically difficult to plant, they're actually quite easy, but because I had a hard time finding reliable information about how to prepare the soil for growing blueberries, because as it's very well known, they like to have an acidic soil between 4.5 and 5.5, and there are so many recommendations out there about how to go about lowering the pH of your soil for blueberries and other things like azaleas and rhododendrons. And some of those methods work, and a lot of them don't very well. They're not very effective. So in this video, I'd like to go over the ones that do work and talk about the ones that don't work so well. So I'll also show the process of how we eventually got these planted, so stick around for that. I won't be covering general information about blueberries in this video, such as cross-pollination, pruning, or different varieties for different climates. All of that information is pretty easy to find elsewhere. I decided to focus on how to adjust soil pH because that's where I had the most difficulty planting blueberries. Before we get into it, I would like to point out that by planting these blueberries directly in the ground, we may have taken a more challenging path. I've learned that it can be very difficult to alter the pH of a soil. There are so many environmental factors above and below ground that are affecting where the pH falls on the scale. It can even change throughout the day depending on the weather and moisture in the soil and biological activity and all that. So anything that you do to try to change the pH is only going to have a temporary effect. If you're trying to maintain a particular pH environment, you're going to have to continue adding amendments at regular intervals. Otherwise, all of those environmental factors are going to buffer the pH back to its original state before you try to change it. So for growing blueberries, it might be best to plant them in containers or raised beds like this, because you can customize the growing media and you'll have a much easier time maintaining that acidic environment for them. I'd originally planned to do that for these blueberries. I wanted to build some cedar beds just for them, but we couldn't afford to do that at the moment, and I was just eager to get them in the ground and get them started because we're going to have to wait a couple of years before we start getting berries from them anyway. So I'm still confident that it should work okay because our soil is already slightly acidic at 6.1. If your soil is more alkaline, above 7, I would definitely recommend growing them in containers or raised beds versus in the ground. So let's take a look at a few of the most common recommendations for lowering the pH of your soil. And there are many others that are not on this list that I didn't have time to investigate for this video. First, coffee grounds. People often assume that since coffee is acidic, then the brewed coffee grounds are also acidic and you can add them to the soil to lower the pH. However, almost all of the acidity is taken with the coffee when it's brewed, and the leftover used grounds are only slightly acidic, and so they will not really change the pH of your soil. They do have a lot of nitrogen and some potassium and phosphorus and lots of other minerals, and they will feed the soil bacteria, but they are not going to change the pH, certainly not to the level where blueberries are going to be happy. For more on that, check out this video from Rob at Rob Bob's Aquaponics and Backyard Farm with the link in the description. Next up, pine needles. This is another common one that people often assume can change your soil's pH because pine needles themselves, when they're on the tree, are very acidic. But once they fall off and they decompose into the soil, all of that acidity is gone. And there's another great video by Patrick Dolan and Stephen Legary where they talk more about that. You can also check that out with the link down below. And the next one on the list is gypsum. Since gypsum is chemically known as calcium sulfate, and sulfur is commonly recommended to lower a soil's pH, then sulfate should do the same thing, right? Not quite. So sulfur reacts with water and creates sulfuric acid, which does lower soil pH, but sulfate doesn't react with water, it dissolves into it. So it doesn't create acid and will not affect the pH. So gypsum, calcium sulfate, will only remove sodium and replace it with calcium, and that transaction does not alter the pH of the environment. So now that we know that none of those methods are going to work very well, let me take you through my rather bumbling process of getting these blueberries planted. So almost everything that I read about growing blueberries recommended using peat moss and mixing that in at the time of planting, because peat is already acidic at about 4.5. It will improve drainage for heavy clay soils like we have, and it will also retain water. But I was really reluctant to buy that again because it's a non-renewable resource, and I had avoided using it for the last couple of years. But since everybody was suggesting it, I decided I'll go ahead and buy some. And then I continued researching and saw that some people were saying the peat was not going to affect the pH of the soil for very long, sometimes just a matter of days, depending on the pH level of the soil. Especially if it was very alkaline, it could very quickly bring that soil back up to where it is, and it just wasn't going to have much of an effect. So I continued researching more and found that elemental sulfur was probably going to be the best option for lowering the pH for at least a little bit longer period. It was still going to be a temporary fix, and I would need to reapply it a couple of times a year, but that sounded a lot better than peat moss to me, so I decided to use sulfur instead of peat. So I prepared the soil by hand tilling the top 4 to 6 inches and mixing in elemental sulfur at a rate of 1 pound per 100 square feet, which in this case turned out to be about 5.3 ounces for this 32 square foot area. Now, sulfur takes about 6 months to break down in the soil and lower the pH. As I said before, it reacts with water and is broken down by microorganisms in the soil and converted into sulfuric acid, and that's how it lowers the pH. Since our soil is already at 6.1, I figured the plants would be happy enough until the sulfur had time to take effect. And the breakdown process will slow down over the winter when there's very little microbial activity, and then pick back up in the spring as the soil gets warmer. Each year I'll have to apply top dressings of sulfur to the soil surface underneath the mulch just before and just after the main growing season. And here is where I second guess myself. We got the blueberries transplanted, and I was concerned about them growing in our sticky clay soil, so at the last minute I decided to add in the peat moss after all. I mixed rainwater into it first so it wouldn't blow away on me, and then carefully tilled it in around the plants, and I did this at a rate of about 1/3 peat moss to 2/3 soil. This would at least improve drainage, reduce compaction, and it would mean that I could still use the peat moss that I wasn't too thrilled to buy in the first place. Once that was all mixed in, I breathed a heavy sigh of relief and raked a layer of wood chips over the soil. And I made sure to keep the mulch from getting too close to the plants so it didn't pass on any fungal diseases to the plant, and I put protective cages in place around them. The wood chips will suppress the weeds, keep the soil moist, and as they slowly decompose and feed fungal networks in the soil, they'll also play a part in keeping the soil acidic. So it certainly wasn't a smooth ride, but we got it done eventually. So we'll need to keep wood chips in a pretty thick layer around here over the winter to keep the roots safe, and when it comes time to add more sulfur in the spring and fall, we can just pull the wood chips back, lightly sprinkle the sulfur on the soil surface, maybe till it in lightly to the top ½ inch or so of soil, and then put the wood chips back on top. And the wood chips themselves should be all the fertilizer that these plants are going to need, because these will just continue to break down over the years and feed the soil, help to keep it slightly more acidic themselves. And we shouldn't need to add any other kind of fertilizer aside from the sulfur to keep them happy. So thanks for watching, and please hit that thumbs up button if you found this video to be helpful. And be sure to share it with your friends and subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.